The intention in this session is to share something of Sri Aurobindo's life and his writings. Many of you here are already very familiar with both of these, and some of you here perhaps have only a superficial first introduction. And so I will not attempt to meet something halfway. You've all been given already this little booklet called Sri Aurobindo, a Survey, which offers you in summary form a perspective of all these. Instead, I will concentrate on certain highlights which allow us to understand more deeply Sri Aurobindo himself as well as his work, but also the inspiration that it represents for our individual lives and the work we have to do. As most of you know, Sri Aurobindo's father was very keen that he should grow up entirely as an Englishman. And so he deliberately insulated him from all exposure to Indian culture. At the age of 4, he was put in a boarding school run by the British. At the age of 6, he was sent to England to study and become an Englishman. For 21 years, Sri Aurobindo grew up in that environment with practically no exposure to India and India's traditions, other than what little came through the reading of certain texts of the Upanishads and as part of the British education. What you see in this young man growing up in England is under extreme hardship of physical discomfort, not enough food, not enough clothing, very little money coming to sustain his education. He shines brilliantly through his entire education, completing his education in Cambridge for what was at that time the Indian Civil Service, passing every examination with the highest marks, writing brilliantly, brilliant insights of thought, depth, scope of knowledge, his mastery of languages going to the roots. We find him not only mastering Greek and Latin, but writing poetry in ancient Greek spontaneously. Of course, because these are also the root languages for the European languages, he also has an exposure to French, which he reasonably masters, as an exposure to other languages including Russian and Italian, and subsequently coming into India, he opens himself out through Sanskrit to a range of Indian languages, including Gujarati, Bengali, which was his mother tongue, Marathi, Hindi, of course, Tamil. And what we find surprising in some of his writings, he makes references to Arabic as one of the ancient languages that he will refer to justify his theory of language. And so what you see is something so extraordinary in scope just on this one aspect of language, but also in his poetry which flows in various languages, including poetry written in multiple languages also. But in exceeding in his educational framework of England in every way, had he continued that line of development, he would have been surely selected by the British as among the senior most in the Indian civil service to rule India. And he had that option, he had the choice, because he excelled in everything. And something happens which is quite surprising. Of course, by the age of 12, he has already had a certain opening by the first contact with the Upanishads, a certain opening which he describes as a mental realization of the Brahman. And a certain inner movement has begun. He makes a choice. The choice is, of course, conveniently offered to him. There was the riding test, which was one of the qualifications for the ICS, for which his instructor would mostly not come and just leave them around. He could have still passed it. It was a trivial thing to pass. But Sri Aurobindo chooses to not appear for it and thereby fails in the exam. So he made sure that he got through the exam with the highest marks, but on a technicality gets a fail. And then goes to India with this. So avoids entirely the entry into the Indian civil service, which was his father's dream. And so it was a skillful bypass of a very technical situation, a very difficult situation. He had to satisfy his father, and yet he had to satisfy his soul's call. And instead, he joins the Maharaja of Baroda as the chief secretary of the whole kingdom of Baroda, the state of Baroda. Here, what he would have done for the whole of India under British rule, he manages to do in independence under the Maharaja. And as a state secretary, he literally reworks the entire development program of the entire state. The text of which, or rather the framework of which, is found in 2 lectures which the Maharaja of Baroda gives, which were written by Sri Aurobindo. So you find there the essential components of what effective governance requires and how to rebuild the entire economy, but also the political framework, how to resolve problems by various means. And within that, there is a certain depth of wisdom, the full scope of which we don't have because we don't know which of the other talks of the Maharaja he wrote. But there are incidents, there are stories. One of the most revealing is one in which he goes on a morning walk and he sees the Maharaja in mufti. Those were days when the king would dress up as a commoner and wander around in his kingdom to see what's wrong and what needs to be set right. Because as you know, when the Prime Minister goes today, the roads are prepared, common men are pushed out, so you never get to see the real situation. And as happened in Bangalore recently, the road was relaid, the Prime Minister goes away, and a week later the road is in shambles. It's just an appearance that's created to maintain that position of power. So here they would go in mufti. Terrorism was not yet in place, so you could safely do that. Today I don't think it's possible. So he sees the king, Maharaja, walking down the road, and there's an old lady who's starting her day, and she has a whole burden of sticks that she's trying to lift to place on her head to walk down to sell. It's firewood. Maharaja stops, bends down, helps her lift the burden and place it on her head, and she goes away, and he's pleased with himself. Meanwhile, Sri Aurobindo has seen this from far, and as he approaches, the Maharaja looks to Sri Aurobindo with a great pride. See, I helped this old woman, and Sri Aurobindo laughs. The Maharaja senses it and asks him, okay, what did I do wrong? Sri Aurobindo's simple response: for the Maharaja to put the burden on the head of a woman is not his highest attainment. His highest attainment would be to relieve the burden. Just a simple observation like that on a day-to-day little event, and you get the insight. Maharaja, of course, immediately took it to heart, and he greatly appreciated Sri Aurobindo, depended on him entirely. And so the next day he issues orders and then summons that woman, finds out who she is, summons her, and she's scared what's going to happen. And he gifts to her a house and says that hereafter, for the rest of your life, you will be looked after by the state. A worthy gesture of a Maharaja. A simple laugh from Sri Aurobindo initiates a chain of events. But it's not just that. It is the entire state policies were defined from such a deeper perspective. Had Sri Aurobindo truly been the ruler of India, you can imagine what it would have done for India's development But it would have been, unfortunately, under false intentions of the British rule, which were designed to exploit and not to develop India. I don't go too much into that aspect. They destroyed Indian industries in order to enrich the British Empire and so on. Subsequently, Sri Aurobindo enters more deeply into the freedom struggle. And at some point that came into conflict with the position of the Maharaja, and so he stepped down from that position and entered full-fledged into the freedom struggle. When he came on the scene, India was largely controlled by a British-inspired, what we call today, controlled opposition. So they created the Indian National Congress, which was created by a Britisher and intended to redirect the freedom movement to supplicate to the British. So it's like if you go against the British, you join the Congress, but in the process you supplicate further. Sri Aurobindo entered into the political space. First of all, went all around preparing a grassroots revolution. He attends the Surat meeting of the Congress and splits the Congress into two. There was a tent where Sri Aurobindo was staying. Everybody who came to the Surat Congress went to Sri Aurobindo's tent and not the moderates. He was called the extremist. Why? Because he demanded complete independence. The basis for his demand for complete independence was not hate for the British or criticism of their ruling or their style. These might have been there incidentally, but that was not his primary objective. He said, for the future of the world's survival, India has a crucial role to play. And unless India plays that role, the world's unity and the world's future will not be. For India to be able to play that role, India must first find her soul, which she has lost, obviously. In order to be able to find her soul, she has to be free. And therefore, the whole effort for India's independence. You see, the whole perspective is what has to happen a few hundred years down. And the preparation for that is the freedom. It's not from a position of hate. Yes, of course, you can criticize. He does write articles criticizing in a very striking, penetrating, subtle, and very earthy humor. Placing things for what they are, showing options, different ways of doing. So all his political writings begin, which if you read today, although they describe events of that period, you read them today and you think, oh my God, he's describing the current crisis in such and such a place. And the solution he offers are relevant today. So he would go incisively to the key issues and find key solutions. And unfortunately, because they're put in a context of that period, most people don't bother to read those articles. But I would highly recommend them for those who are interested. And the result of these articles is people are provoked to think. And now to face the reality of what's happening and actually start dreaming of the change that can be, the future that must be. And the result was, and combined with his lectures that he was giving extensively traveling all over India, the result is an awakening at a grassroots level to a degree that the British find their hold on India now becoming destabilized. And the Viceroy of India sends a message to the British Parliament and the King declaring Aurobindo Ghosh as the most dangerous man in India today. And what did he do? He did not even pick up a gun. He just wrote articles and gave speeches. The most dangerous man in India today. And you have to wonder how powerful that was, his action. He brings it to the brink where already the freedom is imminent and the British are desperate to find a way to stop him and to suppress the movement. They found a way to put him in jail on some technicality that had the effect that for 1 year the bulk of it he was in solitary imprisonment. At the end of it, when he comes out, he gives a speech where he says, the British tried to stop me, the only benefit of that was that I found God. Now, we're going to discuss a little bit about what happened there because it's a significant part of his life. But a month before that, he had already entered by that time a deeper phase of his spiritual life. And that's also interesting how it started. He was with one of his family members who was sick, and there was a monk who was passing by, who saw this, who came to the house to beg for alms, and then he sees this sick person and says, "Bring me a glass of water." He repeats a mantra and with a knife makes a cross on the water and says, "Give him the water and he'll be cured." He goes away, the person is given the water and he's cured immediately. Sri Aurobindo sees this and he says, if yoga can give such a power, then can I gain greater power by yoga to free India? And he begins a process of discipline of yogic practices. And these have already gone to a certain degree of development that a month before he is put in jail, he already receives an inner intimation that he needs to withdraw from politics. How do you do that? When you are at the very hub of the whole movement, you cannot just let go. And he could not. When he is put in jail, he says to Sri Krishna, "I was here to serve the country. Why did you stop me and put me in jail?" And the answer he receives is, "Remember, I asked you to leave politics and you could not. You were too attached, so I broke your attachments." And thus begins a different phase of his sadhana, where in jail he enters in depth in the sadhana. Now he has 24 hours to himself in solitary confinement. The first phase of which is a turn to madness, because when you're all alone in a little cell where you can barely lie down, you're given a plate which is your plate to eat food and also to pass motions in the same plate, pass urine in the same plate. And that's, he wrote later, this was the highest standard of British rule. But what do? Where does your mind go? You do not even have access to the sun. You just have a little window on top far above to give you a little fresh air. Your only companions is a line of ants walking by, and 24 hours in semi-darkness. How do you survive that? And he feels himself as if on the brink of losing his balance. And that's when the inner being pushes forward a series of experiences, and the inner journey begins with full concentration. At some point, there's some let out. He is allowed to go out for about 2 hours every day and walk in the free air, during which time he describes how he dwells on the mantras of the Upanishads, dwelling on the perception of the divine in all things. And a deeper entry begins. He describes how gradually he began to feel the divine immanent, and the love that flowed to him from the divine and the love that flowed out from him, and his nature began to change, which was his nature, which was largely rajasic, beginning to become more sattvic, and so on. So all this represents a phase of his sadhana, the full scope of which we do not have on record, other than a few incidents. There's a period when he's doing intense pranayama also, and the jailer sees him as if his body tilted, as if floating above, with one knee resting on the ground and the whole body tilted, as if in a state of levitation. And the jailer was, of course, very alarmed, and since then began to treat Sri Aurobindo with greater respect and began to offer him more amenities for his comfort. So we do see certain important things happening at that time, but the most important was, on his emergence, he finds the entire freedom movement has been snuffed out. Because the British went around, arrested everybody, put everyone in jail, and the movement died. He restarted the movement, started 2 journals, and all those articles are also extremely important. He widened the scope of his movement to prepare the foundations for a new education for the India that has to be rebuilt. Because the education itself at that point had been warped, as you know, under Macaulay's objectives to turn India into a nation of clerks. The mind had to be seized upon. The mind had to be numbed and conquered and to be enslaved. And then, the series of policies by which the various different parts of Indian linguistic or racial types were made to compete with each other to prove yourself to be a better slave than the other. And so the whole turn of education was to enslavement of the mind. And Sri Aurobindo now begins a journey of rebuilding the civilization itself with education. Accepts to be the principal of this Bengal college and puts into practice this framework. His early writings of that period, interestingly, they parallel almost 1 or 2 years off from Montessori, who is working in Italy, who has her own ideas of education. What is interesting is, later on, Madame Montessori was driven out of her country under Mussolini's rule, and so she comes to India to find shelter, ends up living in Adyar in Madras, barely 100 miles from Pondicherry, lives there 13 years, writing her most important books on education. By then she has come in touch with Sri Aurobindo, read Sri Aurobindo's writings, and finds this very strong parallels. And what we discover is she knew Sri Aurobindo also personally. One of her last books, she wrote by hand, it's a beautiful handwriting, a dedication to Sri Aurobindo and sent the book as a gift to him. When the ashram school began, she wrote a letter to the children of the ashram school, telling them what a beautiful opportunity they have to grow up in this spiritual space. So we see Sri Aurobindo's writings on education, Montessori's writings on education, and the interrelation between them, just as an aside. But very soon, although Sri Aurobindo has reinitiated the movement of rebuilding of India, the inner call becomes more firm. He's shown that this work is now to be completed by others. He gets the inner command to go eventually to Pondicherry. The yoga enters a phase of such intensity that we can only appreciate or get a glimpse of it through his diary notes of that period, which are called the Record of Yoga. It comes in 2 gigantic volumes today, more than 1,500 pages, I think. Very cryptic notes because they're notes to himself, where he describes, first of all, the framework of the yoga, which becomes later on the integral yoga, which was revealed to him by Sri Krishna, but then the practice through which he implements this whole development. So we'll have occasion to speak about this in greater detail in the next session in the afternoon, which is on the nature of the integral yoga itself. But while he is doing this, which is a 24-hour comprehensive, dedicated focus of sadhana, he has very little food because there's not enough money even for that. And he's eating most days just plain rice with salt, and that's all that he can afford. But the sadhana is going well and with a certain intensity. Already a glimpse of this is seen while he is in jail, when you remember you are denied all basic amenities, so even a shower is a rarity. But as he goes out, his jailmates who are working with him in freedom, they say, "How is it your hair is shining? Have they given you hair oil?" Sri Aurobindo says, "No." "Then how is your hair shining?" Sri Aurobindo says, "I've stopped taking showers." What? And then Sri Aurobindo explains that as a result of the yoga force working in his body, the working of the cells in his body has changed, and his body manufactures the necessary fat to oil the hair. And so his hair comes out oiled. As it grows out, it's fresh oiled. And the body does not smell anymore, even if he doesn't take a shower. Interesting, isn't it? The nature of change in the physical consciousness and its working as a result of the spiritual force. But going to Pondicherry now, this is multiplied 100-fold at least. And you read some of the passages from the diary, you find other things happening where all the inner perceptions begin to grow, the inner life develops, the opening to the infinity of the consciousness which is now embodied within him, and the levels of consciousness that he is ascending and integrating, and as a result, the different aspects, the 6-fold aspect of perfection of the integral yoga. Among them is the natural influence that his now widened consciousness has on circumstances. And there are various aspects to this. I do not use the technical terms, but whatever he wills spontaneously begins to happen. Whatever he needs, even without willing intentionally, tends to form around him. And whatever he needs to know appears as a direct intuitive perception. So there's a perception as well as an action simultaneously taking place on a huge scale. So there's one incident, one notation he makes at a very early stage, where he sees a bird flying, he puts an intention and the bird turns as intended. He sees a young boy walking on the road, he puts an intention for the boy to turn from where he's going, go elsewhere, roll up a mat and place it. And the boy looks at the mat, hesitates, and then continues. Sri Aurobindo sends a second will. This time the boy turns, goes, rolls up the mat, places it, and then goes on his way. And then Sri Aurobindo's comment, typically the response of a tamasic nature. So he needed a second kick to push him to do that. But this is not all. It's happening on a larger scale. He is describing now the Viceroy of India is sick. He's watching this through the newspapers. And then he puts a will to heal the Viceroy's sickness and watches over the next few days how he responds. He begins to influence events elsewhere in the world. I believe there's a reference to events taking place in Turkey at that time as well as in England. And by then, soon after the First World War begins, at which point he is also intervening on events there, describing those events as well as intervening, and so on. The mother comes at that point. And again, we don't go into details, most of you are already familiar with this. But at that time, she was married to Paul Richard, who proposed to Sri Aurobindo to start a journal. And Sri Aurobindo accepted because he said, because it was my yogic decision to accept whatever comes my way. They start a journal together, the World War starts, Paul Richard leaves. And Sri Aurobindo is left alone to write his journal. The journal is a monthly with a large number of pages. As it began, Sri Aurobindo was writing 4 series of articles, which effectively become 4 books, writing 1 chapter at a time. So he writes The Life Divine, The Synthesis of Yoga, The Secret of the Veda, and the Isha Upanishads. Chapter 1 of each, straight on the typewriter. No notes, no prior planning of any kind. Now imagine if you had to write 1 book. What do? You do your research, you put together your thoughts, you arrange your thoughts, you make notes, you create a structure, you revise, you adjust, revise, adjust, go back and forth across chapters to make it consistent, to have a clear development of thought, and so on. None of this. Sri Aurobindo sits down at the typewriter, finished 1 page, second page, and he's completed his article, Book 1, Chapter 1. Book 2, Chapter 1, sends it all to the press. No need to revise. At best, a spelling correction while typing, and that's about it. It comes back from the press, he goes through the proofs, and it's done. Now, remember, he's writing 4 books at a time. But he's not writing all through the month, because he's doing his sadhana. So he had informed one of his assistants, whenever it's time to give the manuscripts, let me know. So his assistant will come and say, okay, now it's time for the manuscripts. Sri Aurobindo sits down and writes chapter 2, chapter 2, chapter 2, chapter 2. 6 months down, he's writing chapter 6, chapter 6, chapter 6, chapter 6. Now, when you read those books in sequence of the chapters, you cannot make out that someone's written them in parallel 4 at a time. And when Paul Richard leaves, now he is left to complete the entire journal himself. There are 2 more books that he starts. So at the peak, he's writing 6 books at the same time, 1 chapter at a time. No notes anywhere necessary. Now, you will look at that and say, oh, what a brilliant intellect, memory, whatever else. Yes, perhaps. Of course, that is true. During the time when he was in Baroda, while he is running the whole administration for the Gujarat state, he is also reading a crate full of books every week. He's ordering books, they come in a crate. At the end of the week, he's finished reading them all. And with full recall. Okay, yes, he had a brilliant memory also. He had a brilliant intellect also. But that's not it. You cannot do that even with a brilliant memory and intellect. You have to have, at the same time, the full conception of the entire unfolding of each book in your awareness, isn't it? And I'd give an analogy here. If I were to ask you to describe your life story from birth up to now, from the perspective of your relationship with your family, well, you would give a narration. And now I ask you to describe your life story from birth till now, from the perspective of the activities that you did with friends. Well, you would give a different narration. And then I say, now give me the same story from how your ideas of your own future developed. Well, you'll give me a different narration. You don't have to remember things in that sense. The sequence is already laid out to you. And if you've written chapter 1 that goes up to age 5, okay, now you begin from age 6. So when you write from an experience, you do not need a memory. It is the sequence of unfoldment of experiences that you're expressing. What Sri Aurobindo wrote was not 6 books. He wrote from a single experience of the totality of reality. In a consciousness which held the reality in a single identity, a single experience of identity. And then the mind turns to isolate a certain aspect, formulates this, another aspect, formulates this, another aspect, formulates this. So it's not a question of memory, rather it is an awareness of an experience. Okay, I've described it up to here, now I begin this. On this third aspect, I've described up to here, I begin the next chapter. And so on. There are literally 6 aspects of a single experience. When you look at these books, though, because they are so distinct in their form and in their content, one would think, this is a philosophical work, that is the Life Divine. The Synthesis of Yoga, that is a practice orientation and the psychology of yoga and its application. And then you have the Secret of the Veda, which is an analysis of various aspects of the text, and then he takes up actual passages and translates them. And then the Upanishads, again, chapter-wise, he's unfolding the sequence of the Upanishads. But what you see is the last chapter is perfectly synchronized with the first chapter. He has anticipated it. Because in his experience, the whole thing is a single experience, which he has put in sequence of fragments. He knew right as he was writing the first word, the entire unfoldment, not in words, but in thoughts. So when you start reading the Arya as he wrote it, chapter 1, chapter 1, chapter 1, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 2, you actually see a certain commonality. The very first impulse of all the first chapters is the human aspiration. Very interesting. That's the basis, the first chapter in the Life Divine. In the Synthesis of Yoga, similarly, it is the movement of the impulse of our evolution. In the Secret of the Veda and the passages from the Veda which he translates, he takes up Agni and so on. And as he unfolds, it's as if a multifaceted unfoldment of an entire experience. Very quickly, 3 or 4 chapters down, the human mind is unable to maintain the continuity of the whole, and we fragment it already as separate books. But it is worthwhile as an experience. Even those of you who have read these books, read them as he wrote them in the Arya, and it is a fascinating experience. So this is just to give you a glimpse of that aspect. And we'll touch upon what those books contain or the significant ideas which for us, especially in our lives, are so important. But I'll just complete Sri Aurobindo's journey thereafter. He completes his 7 years of the Arya, interestingly paralleling almost exactly the First World War. So here is a huge dark event which could embroil the entire world into chaos and confusion, and almost exactly at the same time, down to the month, Sri Aurobindo begins this revelation of a completely new vision and knowledge and practice and power and insight. And it parallels as this First World War ends, the Arya also stops. And he writes, he says that I could have continued writing. I could have continued writing for, I don't remember exactly the words he uses, something like 70 years, writing 7 times as much, and I would still not have completed 1/10 of the knowledge that had been revealed to me. But he said what is written is already pretty much along the limits of what the current human mind can appreciate, and so he left it at that. He did not really end it, in the sense that his subsequent writings, some of the letters which he wrote, some of the revisions he made on many of the chapters in the Life Divine, he added new chapters later, both for the Life Divine and the Synthesis of Yoga and so on. And of course, Savitri show you what was the direction and scope of the further knowledge that he had. But again, these are merely glimpses, because there is so much more that he did not write that he knew. Just to give an example here, there's a whole discussion he had with Pavitra. He was a Frenchman, Philippe Barbier Saint-Hilaire, who was named Pavitra by Sri Aurobindo, who had interest in astrology and of course the sciences. He was a technical engineer from one of the most reputed engineering schools of Europe at the time in Paris. And he asked his technical questions to Sri Aurobindo, and astrology questions, by the way. So he does an analysis of someone's horoscope, shares it with Sri Aurobindo, and Sri Aurobindo says, no, this is wrong, this is right, and makes corrections on his astrology. And subsequently, there's a period during which Pavitra makes horoscopes of most of the disciples who come, and Sri Aurobindo looks at his observations and corrects him. In fact, we do find there are a couple of writings of Sri Aurobindo on astrology, one of which is dated 1909. That's just as he begins his yoga, where it's as if he's going to write a book. He says, Materials for a New Astrology. That's the title. And then he says the astrology of today is shot through with errors because the true authorities are not known and the true principles are not known. Here we will present with a few examples what is the right approach. And he begins an analysis of his own horoscope. Interesting. And one of the comments he makes, looking at a certain combination of planets, he says, this means it will be a person who will embody the totality of human knowledge in a single person. This particular combination. Another combination he speaks of as representing this is so rare, he says, and in combination with other combinations, it's so rare that he says this represents the one who has come to do the first work of the Satya while in the Kali. It's quite amazing. And then he describes, using the astrological principles, his brothers and their characters and so on. And then he describes his wife, describes certain elements of the life, and then suddenly there's an abrupt shift, and then he starts speaking of the woman. It's no more his wife, it's the woman. And what he describes perfectly matches the mother. And the later part of the chart, he comes to this point where he says, they will have, so in the chart there are houses for various things. So there's the house for children. And he says the children, because of certain combinations, would be titans as well as gods. So great in their capacity. And then how he interprets it to mean that all this suggests the creation of a kind of a mystical community where where everybody will be like children to them, and the children's children will be the beginning of a new race. Very suggestive, of course, intuitively perceived. And then of his own, there's the house of death. When he comes to the analysis of that, he says because of this combination, he will not die from accident. Because of that combination, he will not die from old age. Because of such and such a combination, he will have the choice to live or die when he chooses. Because of that combination, he will choose not to leave. So now there's a gridlock. How do you explain this? And then he draws upon an ancient tradition that says Venus represents transformation. And then he makes an analysis that says there will be a transformation of his consciousness, effectively a kind of an immortality. And all this is 1909. And he calculates the date for it. It's fascinating, fascinating text. It just shows you the body of knowledge he had just on a narrow field such as astrology, which is largely unknown because he did not bother to write books about it. What he wrote, though, was aimed at what would be of value for all of humanity for the coming many hundred years. And so I'm going to give you a kind of a hint, a glimpse of some of these things. In the Life Divine, for example, you see the philosophical formulation. He takes up the core of the problems of existence, which philosophers across the ages have been struggling with. Going back to the Upanishadic philosophers, the Platonian philosophers, the modern philosophers, and whatever may be the cross currents between them, he goes to the key problems, but structured with such clarity, like a brilliant lawyer going point by point and says, but one could argue this way, to which you could have a counter argument this way, and it's literally every possible argument has been taken into account and brought through to conclusion. Of course, there are passages where you're in a gridlock by logic alone. And he says, then you have to go beyond logic and look upon these kinds of experiences, draw upon a deeper intuition, and he gets you out of the gridlock of logic in those cases. And so in this way, for the coming hundreds of years, any problem you may have of existence or conflict of perspectives, you will find here insights as well as the means and the clarity to find your way out of it. And this is an extraordinary text, extremely demanding on the intellect. Because when you represent knowledge, not reasoned out knowledge, but experienced knowledge, and experienced in a higher domain of consciousness, you have as if a simultaneous vision of a whole in which 100 ideas are held in perfect relation with each other. Now, remember, this is, to give an analogy, you take this beautiful bunch of roses and flowers and try to describe the whole thing to somebody who's not seeing it. You have to start somewhere. In front is this blue flower. Above it is a red rose. To its right, to its left, and you will start a description. Have the other fellow draw it out. You'll end up with a huge mess. Because your description has to be linear of something which is three-dimensional, and you could take any number of pathways in describing, but after all the descriptions, the exact relation which will never be complete. To be able to give an exact description, if you have 20 roses, you will need to describe the relationship of every single rose with all other 19 from its perspective. That's the only way you can get a complete description. So to describe 20 roses will require something like 1,000 different statements to get the complete description, right? You can't. And now when you're describing ideas which are so complex with interwoven sub-ideas and nuances, all of which are captured in the Life Divine, and you have to serialize it in sequence, you get sentence structures which are complex. And sometimes a single word is used, which is then elaborated in another paragraph, which you have to really appreciate the connection for to fully appreciate. So he will use a phrase or a parenthetical statement. The parenthetical statement gets an elaboration in another chapter. After you've read the whole of the Life Divine, you come back and reread. Now suddenly this parenthetical statement, which was for you just like a peg, expands into a whole chapter later on. And your understanding of this paragraph suddenly widens out. You complete the whole reading again, come back and reread. By then your mind has become wider. Your capacity of interrelation of ideas has awakened. And now when you reread, it's as if he has decompressed. What was a tightly compressed description, it's got decompressed. You read one sentence and your mind is blown. Wow, he's captured so much. And in this way, he's lifting your mind, widening your mind, and taking it to that poise in which he experiences the whole knowledge. So it's difficult because in the beginning it is challenging. It really forces the boundaries of your intelligence to widen out. And if you stop with that, you have professors who will tell you, I've read everything and understood. Ask them to explain, they will only give you a summary of ideas. Ask them, why is he repeating this word? What is the nuance of these terms? They don't get it. But if you allow yourself to be carried, your mind becomes intuitivized. And as you read, a word suggests and opens out to a whole possibility of further knowledge. So literally what he has done is taken his experience in consciousness, infused it, structured it in a rational sequential form, But sometimes it happens on certain pages, not always. An entire page is a single sentence, within which there are 4 or 5 sub-sentences, within which there are parenthetical comments and nuances. And to be able to capture that in a single thought is difficult for the beginning. But read it, continue, and then come back. The second time you'll capture more, the third time more, and the fourth time perhaps you will get it. Wow! And your mind is blown. It's stunned literally at that moment. And you have to allow yourself to remain in that stunning state, because then you're pushed into a silence of mind in which the experience is held in a vision and no more as thought or idea. He's literally lifted your mind from thinking mind to what he has called higher mind, where ideas are more complex, multifaceted, to the illumined mind, where you see, and from there intuitive mind, where you experience and live an experience of it. And all of this, eventually, if you really allowed the process combining with the practices in the synthesis of yoga, you will experience in a mind which now approaches infinity and what will be called the overmental experience, where you realize every chapter in the life divine is as if looking at the totality of reality, first from this angle, then from that, then from that, then from that. It's as if you take a diamond, or in this case your 20 roses, describe the entire diamond from one face, then another, then another, then another. And that's what each chapter represents. And at that point, you are able to hold the totality of life divine in a single experience. Wow, what a gift. Your one life is not enough to be able to get to the fullness of what it conveys to you. And that's why I said it will go on for a few hundred years. People will read, and the mind of humanity will be lifted as you read. But if you work at the same time on the synthesis of yoga, which gives you the practices and the forms of experiences, your mind can be rapidly prepared for this, and the life divine and the synthesis become complementary, so to say. And then there is an experience you can have. Remember, he reached that poise within 5 years of his sadhana. And maybe we take a little longer, but still we can reach that poise and that experience, at least to some extent, isn't it? Otherwise it would be pointless. So you have the synthesis of yoga again, where he takes up the introduction. Synthesis of yoga is, by the way, in 5 parts. First part is called the introduction, and that's 5 chapters. Where he introduces the whole concept of what is the synthesis of yoga. You can read that much and get the whole glimpse of what he's aiming at. But then what he tries to do becomes 3 more parts, which is the yoga of works, the yoga of knowledge, the yoga of love, which are multiple chapters in themselves, anything going from 5 to 15, I don't remember anymore. And then comes the 5th part, which is the yoga of self-perfection, which is the integral yoga proper. Resting on these 3 approaches of yoga, of works, knowledge, and love, that is in the Sanskrit, the karma yoga, bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, and bhakti yoga, which also Sri Krishna elaborates upon in the Bhagavad Gita, for which he has essays on the Gita, also one of the 6 parallel books that he is writing later on. And there he gives you an understanding of that form of the practice, which is the yoga of the Bhagavad Gita, but which is a useful foundation for the integral yoga, although not necessary in itself, because most of the elements have been taken in. And yet, he writes extensively on the essays on the Gita because it is still captures the crux of the problem of life and of right action, and how to overcome the gridlock that we experience today. And he leads you step by step to this deeper understanding. The nature of that understanding is so comprehensive, so complete, that not only you have this understanding of the problem of the gridlock, but also of human nature itself, which complements what is in the synthesis of yoga, where he deals with a different objective, which is the yoga practice. Here he deals with the psychology of the elements which enter into conflict. And so if you have read this, you come to synthesis of yoga, you find what is a single sentence in synthesis of yoga is an entire chapter in the essays on the Gita. And now you understand better because you've read this. And this is the case now across books. You read a passage here and you read a chapter there and you find the correspondence or the elaboration. So really the full appreciation of Sri Aurobindo would not be, his writings would not be unless you read it all. But, well, you start with what, and that's why he has reduced it in book form or chapter form so that the human mind can capture piecemeal. But you could read and reread and go across the books and continue for a few hundred years to get the full amplification of it. I'm going to divert once again from this briefly to show that in the synthesis of yoga, there's a whole description of the 5 elements. You know, the concept which is described not only in the Indian, I would say from the Vedic tradition onwards, but which you find in Ayurveda as an application for health, which you find in the systems of warfare for the training of the body, which you find in the philosophy for description of how matter is formed, and so on. It's like 5 elements is at the core of it all, which then comes through the Greek tradition where they knock out the 5th element somehow, ether, which is the unifying principle, and focus much more on the first 4. Sri Aurobindo describes the 5 elements in the synthesis of yoga in passing, in the essays on the Gita in some elaboration, and then in the Life Divine equally, and then in his commentary on the Kena Upanishad. If you read all of these, you will see that each is complementing the other in some way. Because although you can take that as a sub-theme, the angle here is different, the angle there is different, the angle there is different. You read it all and you get the full picture. And there's an element in the full picture, particularly in the Life Divine, where he goes to hardcore particle physics. And with a conclusion which is so extraordinary as to preempt all the mistakes that science is going to make and prevent them from making the mistake if only they had followed his indication. What happened when he wrote this 1914, 1915, in a chapter in the Life Divine? Einstein had just put out his first theory of relativity, which had this peculiar feature that suddenly, while everything in the world is relative, the speed of light is made absolute. And so space and time have to twist and bend over backwards to keep the speed of light constant, which somehow feels wrong if you really go into it in depth. And then comes his general theory of relativity, where because he equates gravity with acceleration sustained, again, space and time have to be warped around to maintain this equivalence, which equivalence can easily be proved to be wrong. But, and physics is resisting it, one of the implications of it all is that ether is thrown out permanently from physics. All of physics until then was built on the assumption of an ether. Electric, magnetic, and other phenomena were, so to say, processes of the ether. They were all thrown out. Sri Aurobindo writes at that time in the Life Divine, ether can and does exist, even if to our present instruments it is not detectable. And then he explains the rationale. He explains how particles form and how you could go on dividing particles into smaller particles. You will never come to an ultimate particle. And he gives you the rationale for it, which is not only philosophical but scientific. So if you read Sri Aurobindo as a scientist, you will find extraordinary material. But he did not write a book on science. Had he done that, it would have been extremely dangerous, perhaps. Because he's looking at a science which is so much more powerful, including nuclear physics, by the way. In one of the poems he writes, a scientist played with atoms and blew out the universe before God had time to shout. And this is before the atomic bomb is exploded. He's telling you that you can literally blow out the universe by playing with atoms. If you asked a physicist 10 years before, they would say, what kind of nonsense? Atoms are so small. To have a big explosion, you need a mass which is big. You can't do it with small things. Sri Aurobindo tells you at that time, the deeper you go into the infinitesimal, the greater the power of action you have. And he gives you the rationale for it. And the hints for mastering the technology. He's way ahead of science. In the Life Divine, he's describing the trends of technology of miniaturization and subtilization and says where that will end up eventually. What you have today as a mobile phone is only one step. There are further steps. still to come. And he's literally telling you what those steps are going to be. It's amazing. And he is writing Savitri up to 1950, let's say. In Savitri, he describes under, if you will recall, the three soul powers and the warped echo against each of those powers. He describes the human ego saying, it's the tamasic ego, the rajasic ego, and the sattvic ego saying, I have achieved all these things and I am going to achieve all those things. That's often scientific attainments. Many of which at that time you say, but that's not been achieved. And what he says, I will achieve, many of these have actually been achieved. But what is interesting is I went into depth on this because it interested me. I discovered, yes, there had been scientists who had done it before. In particular, there is Nikola Tesla. So there's a passage where he says, the warped ego claims, I will make water hard as stone and iron soft as velvet. Something like that. Water hard as stone, how does that happen? Of course, hard as steel. Water hard as steel. Hard as steel, very specific. It's not stone, it's steel. Steel, what is the characteristic as distinct from stone? It is actually elastic. It's extremely hard, but it is elastic. You take steel rods and bang against each other, they bounce. There's an experiment Nikola Tesla was doing in 1908 or so, where he was pumping water under such high pressure that a jet of water coming out was as hard as steel, as if it was solid steel. He would take a steel bar and hit the water stream and it would bounce off with a clang as if steel meeting steel. This technology became the basis for what we use today for cutting steel with a jet of water. And this is one of the technologies currently in use. But what Tesla did was much more than this. So the things like that which you read, you say, what's he talking about? And then you discover. One of them is reading the minds of people and the mechanism to read the minds of people and so on. So there's so much there in Sri Aurobindo's writings, although it is put in a certain category which is philosophy, yoga, sociology, politics. When you look inside, he has gone to core principles of each of these. And the core principles being not only universal but also eternal, they apply across different systems of knowledge or application. And in particular, this is going to be of very great importance for the present context, management. He wrote a book on management. Did you know that? In the Ideal of Human Unity. He discusses the problems of how individuals can work together in teams and how these teams can be part of larger objectives of a, let's say, organization, and how organizations can coexist with other organizations with differences. From an administrative point of view, from an economic point of view, from a social point of view, from a psychological point of view, and fundamentally a spiritual point of view, which is the basis unifying all these different perspectives. But when you read that book, you are programmed to think, he's talking politics. Of course, the examples he takes are political. But the principles he describes are root applying to all these. So when you really want to appreciate Sri Aurobindo and learn from him, you have to recognize that every book and every example is intended only as an example. The principle behind is what you have to catch. And so when he describes a principle and gives you an example, pause, look for other examples, and apply it to other fields. And you will find you get the full scope of the knowledge that he had, or at least a glimpse of that. He could have written books on all these, including management and other, perhaps zoology, I don't know, evolution, biological evolution, of course hardcore physics, which you find all over the place in all these things. But he chose to focus on some of these principal aspects, which become these major works. I've not touched upon all of them, but perhaps we don't have time now. But you see equally, the secret of the Veda, he goes into the roots of the Vedic interpretation in the origin of language. And this is extremely important for the future of humanity because on the one hand, it makes you realize what the Veda truly represents. Although that knowledge is mostly lost, people still feel the reverence because intuitively one knows there's something more to it. But also it represents the future potential of this power of mantra, which becomes articulated in his book, which is the Future Poetry. And of course, a lot of elaborations with examples in his letters on poetry, because people asked questions, Amal Kiran particularly. And there we get a glimpse of the origin of human language. And he gives you some fascinating insights. It's as if he's looking at the full spectrum of human civilizational evolution from a linguistic point of view. There's a passage where he takes the first rik of the Rig Veda and describes it by going down in the etymology to each root sound. So the first rik of the Rig Veda goes Agnim ire purohitam yajnasya, etc. Agni, fire. He breaks to the etymology of Ag and Ni. Ire, love, adore. Purohitam. Purohitam is translated as priest. So, Agni, I adore, who is the priest before the sacrifice. That's how it's translated normally. You adore the priest who is before the sacrifice. Doesn't make sense logically, right? He goes to the etymology, Purohita, Pura. Interestingly, all the British towns were something Bara. Bara is a distortion of Pura. Pura is in Sanskrit town also, city. But the root goes to in front. So a wall in front which separates city becomes now the basis for defining a city. But the root sound goes back to standing before. Purohita. Hita is planted, established firmly, with force. So one who stands before with great power. You could translate that, or that becomes the basis for the word being used also as priest, who stands with great power in front of the Lord. But now you see Agni stands, Agni is now the aspiration, stands before the Lord with great power. Suddenly the whole meaning is completely different when you go down to the etymology. And he's describing with the word ire, the reason why I took this. The word ire, the sound r, is neither l nor r. It's something in between r. And he says this sound r, which is still present in Sanskrit and in Marathi incidentally and in Tamil, he says was a variation of the sound during the Dwapara Yuga, which later reduced to la and ra in various languages. Now you see the knowledge he has of the way language has evolved across the yugas and the etymology of it all going back across yugas. It's just in passing, just a comment like that, and you get a glimpse of what he knew. There is in the record of yoga similarly a whole text of a conversation of Ravana in ancient Sanskrit, which is as if written out, and you get a glimpse of what that style or rhythm of Sanskrit was. But this is just to give you an idea of the kind of knowledge he had of linguistics, of which he could only write so much. But the most important thing of that is not only the going to the roots, but the way the roots are used, the way they articulate themselves in rhythm, in rhyme, to form the power of poetry. And he points to the future of poetry becoming more and more mantric. What makes it mantric? What are the elements that elevate it to a spiritual potency? And what are the nature of the various rhythms and so on? Because finally, remember, we are moving towards a spiritual age. Everything has to acquire a direct representation of the spiritual experience in form of life, isn't it? Speech also, and poetry also, and of course any writing. And you see that in Sri Aurobindo's own writing, even his prose is poetic and his poetry mantric. So this is a glimpse of that aspect, and I don't go too much into the ideal of unity and the human cycle. As I said, even they represent problems of human unity today. He describes the unfolding events, the problems of unification, the dangers of unification in a one-world government and the means to avoid it. But within that, he describes how, by then already the Soviet Union had just come into being. He says how it would not survive and would break up eventually in a confederation of independent states. And at that time, he is describing the European Union and the compulsions of unification economically and then the struggle to unify politically. All the problems which European Union is facing for the last 30 years, he has already mapped out 100 years ago and offered you the means by which these can be resolved. Or similar patterns elsewhere, in the African Union, for example. So although he may take an example of Europe, the principle applies to Africa, the principle applies to India, within the various states or other subgroups that you could have, including linguistic subgroups and other types, any subgroup unifying. So one has to read Sri Aurobindo in a different way to be able to draw out the fullness of his knowledge experience, the way he experienced and lived that whole totality, of which he had to stream it out in sequence through these multiple channels of books, in which he always goes to the essential core of principles which are eternal and universal. Once you capture, in some essence, this, you could go to another planet with completely alien life forms, and all of this would be applicable at the level of principles because they are universal. After 1,000,000 years, you could take this and apply it to whatever circumstances of any life forms because they are eternal principles. Interesting, isn't it? That's the nature of the knowledge embodied, although in now 36 volumes. And therefore, the mother said, any problem, you want an answer, you will find it in Sri Aurobindo. And she says, if you truly read Sri Aurobindo in the right way, you can have access to all knowledge. Now that's quite a claim because it's 36 volumes, limited number of words. How can you have all knowledge, right? Well, this is how you understand it. By going to the root principles and their relationships at their essence. But also there's the other dimension. As he forms the words and the articulates, he opens your mind to the higher and higher ranges. And so there comes a point where as you read, your own mind experiences this on multiple levels simultaneously. In the Vedic tradition, there is this very important idea that the text of the Veda is intended to be experienced on 3 levels. The material, Adi Bhautik, that is the level where it's formed of 5 elements, formed by processes of nature. The second level is Adi Daivik, at the level of psychological powers, where you do not have the compulsion of formation, but they're powers in themselves, but they're fragmented powers, competing in conflict. And Adhyatmik, at the level of the Atman, at the level of the oneness. Now the same words can be experienced, known, understood, lived at the level of the Atman, at the level of psychological conflicting powers, at the level of formative processes of nature. Simultaneously. And your mind has to be trained to be able to, as you read, experience all 3 at the same time. So initially you experience one or the other or the third, and later there comes a time where your mind is able to experience, wow. And the same happens when you read Sri Aurobindo. You read a single sentence, it opens you on multiple levels of application and areas of application. And you go, wow, and you stop and you have to pause to fully assimilate or think out rationally on the different facets. But in this process, he is able to encapsulate literally all knowledge in a finite body of work, but which links you to the infinity of knowledge, of which it is a concretization. Lifts your mind to experience directly as he lived it and knew it. So this would be a kind of a summation of Sri Aurobindo's life and work. And I would encourage you to, of course, not only read this for a more mental, articulated summary of his writings, but also to read Sri Aurobindo directly, to actually have these experiences and work on it, if it so interests you. Otherwise, even as you read as you read Savitri, you have a similar experience, and even with an unprepared mind, a first opening can be made towards the intuitive. Yes.
So much work. Would you be able to give us a guidance on which books to start?
Okay, very important question. There's so many books. What do you start with? My simple answer will be start with that which you find most interesting. My personal entry, I tried to read, I have to confess, I tried to read in sequence the Life Divine, Essays on the Gita. I never went more than 2 or 3 chapters. Because it didn't make sense to me, didn't interest me so much at that age when I started reading. But what did interest me was some aspects of science. So instead of reading in sequence these books, I began to look for those patches and jumping across books. That's how I began to appreciate also this interconnection. And then as my own interest grew and my experience of life grew, other things came up. And the problem came, how do I solve this? What do I do? Where do I find an answer? And so it started in a kind of a patchwork exploration. If that's your way, fine. If for you, because you're already oriented to a certain aspect, that book becomes fascinating, enjoy it and go deep. Inevitably though, after the first few chapters, even if it is poetry that you're interested in and you start reading the future poetry, very quickly it goes into a kind of a depth of experience that is difficult to access by the rational mind. Of course, you understand what he's saying, but you're not sure it makes sense to you because it's going into nuances that you don't experience directly. Don't worry about it. Just read on. Catch rather or absorb elements of what he describes as the principles. Continue and suddenly there'll be patches where you'll again reconnect with your experience and so on. And when you complete, you come back to these passages. And when you reread, suddenly it opens as if a third dimension. Wow, now I get it. So don't worry when it's difficult. Just keep on reading. If you like, come back after the same chapter is completed, you come back. Or complete the book and come back, depending on what is your priority or the depth you want to go to. Also, when you get this hit, and which happens very often, a sentence or a phrase hits you, you're overwhelmed, allow it to sink in. Don't rush to read on. Yes, it's so exciting, I want to read more. Take it easy, become very quiet. It stuns the mind, well, let your mind remain stunned and absorb on a deeper or higher level. Because that's how he's pushing the boundaries of your ken, of your even capacity to hold knowledge. The boundaries are pushed, and the first movement of the pushing is always stunning. The reason doesn't know how to handle. But a kind of a deeper grasp of the intuitive begins to open. Allow it to settle. And that's how your mind will be lifted gradually towards the intuitive. But start with that which interests you. Start with little pieces if you like. I don't recommend compilations. Because the compilation is already a distilled, filtered, rationalized fragment. You will read, oh yeah, that's nice. But you missed that oneness, the continuity, the principles behind that whole experience of widening of consciousness doesn't take place. So I would highly recommend not to stop with compilations, but go rather into these larger works. Yes.
So I have a question. Before reading Savitri, I would read summaries by Panditji, and then go read Savitri because so many.
Yeah.
I would read the summary first.
Right. Yes. Yes, so it all depends on how much you want to enjoy, in what way, and how much time you have. So let's say you're taking Savitri with this intention, you don't have to finish it. So you can enjoy it leisurely. What I would suggest is first you read the text. You understand some elements you don't understand, some things resonate on a deeper level. Then you read the explanations from Panditji's writings, and then read the text all over again. This time suddenly you will understand more deeply and other elements will open up. Right. Yes. So there's some people who read one page before sleeping. So it's very good to sleep. Sri Aurobindo recommended Life Divine more useful for sleeping. Puts you to sleep very quickly. He actually writes that to someone. But that's because it stuns the mind. So I would suggest don't stick to this idea of one page. Read rather for the joy that it gives you, and you may end with a sentence, you may end with a phrase, or you may end up reading 2 pages that day. Just let the flow of the experience soak in. That's more important. Focus on the experience, less on form, and that is more useful.